the United States had something like that during the recovery of the Great Depression, something like, but it never had anything like a public banking system. And the public banking movement, because I know there's some followers who follow this channel, probably follow yours as well, follow your work. There's a lot of frustrations about it because of how alien a concept that is, how just we've been living under the rule of financial sector banking monopolies for so long, several generations now, that it's something that is very alien. But in other parts of the world, and now in this multipolar trend where you have two major big countries focusing and prioritizing even just that one area, it's a seismic wave. It's a complete shift in how the neoliberal world order does things.
Well, yeah, and Danny, briefly, when we talk about those two countries, of course, you're referring to China, which has the biggest economy in the world according to purchasing power parity, which is a much better measurement than just like GDP in US dollars, considering people in China don't use US dollars. And then, of course, the other country you're talking about is Russia, which, if you measure their economy in PPP, it's like the 6th or 5th largest economy, but it's a significant power. And of course, their allies, their strategic allies. But we also should talk about the other block that they're building, right? Which is the BRIC system: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. We also know that Iran and Argentina are probably going to be joining BRICS soon. And we also see the creation of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which includes not only China and Russia, but also India, the second most populous country on earth, and Pakistan, and Iran is joining as well, and major significant countries in Central Asia, like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan. So we're talking about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization includes 40% of global population, more than 30% of global GDP, and then the BRIC system, which is expanding. So they're part of this construction of a new bloc, an economic bloc, a political bloc, and they have differences. There, of course, are significant differences between the Indian government and the Chinese government. The Indian government is, very objectionable. Currently, it's led by a very right-wing party that's very much against working people. That's not the point. The point is that large parts of the global South that were colonized for hundreds of years by European colonialists and U.S. neocolonialists have been trying to create institutions to finally be able to find a new path of development outside of the control of Western colonialism and neocolonialism. That's what we're seeing here. The process of multipolarity is not just about the rise of China and the re-rise of Russia after it was subjugated and partially colonized by Western capital. It's also about the rise of global South nations that were colonized for hundreds of years. So China's growth is absolutely incredible, and it's one of the most remarkable political and economic developments in history, thanks to the leadership of the Communist Party of China. But we're also talking about the significant economic rise of Indonesia, of Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria. Like, this is and of course in Latin America, Brazil, Mexico, Argentina. We're talking about a process of the global South finally being able to pursue a somewhat independent path of development. So even though some of those paths are not socialist, obviously we as socialists would prefer those paths being socialist, and we're going to work toward them being socialist, as in the case of China and Venezuela and Vietnam. So, Nicaragua, Cuba, more countries should pursue that path. But even aside from that, what we're seeing is that this multipolar order allows countries that were quite literally colonized for hundreds of years to finally be able to develop independent of neocolonialism. And that alone, even though it's not necessarily socialism, is a significant, important step for humanity. And it's also a step towards socialism, because you can't develop socialism if you're partially colonized.
Yeah, it's so true. And just another quick note before we transition, I wanted to just mention also that what's significant about the rise of these, what could be called in Leninist terms, oppressed nations, right, that have this history of being targeted, brutalized, plundered by imperialism, rising in this way. What's also significant about this is that it runs very much along with the decline of the American empire, of the imperialist world system. And there's debate about this because I'm saying, well, look at the massive profits. Look at how the United States still dominates the international system. Look at what is happening to Europe. And surely this is not to say that the United States is, on the way out, that imperialism is just on the way out. But it is to say, when you have countries like India, right? We have countries like India, which have incredibly hostile in some areas relations with China. There's been a significant development where their border dispute has been nearly resolved at this point. That's just happened in the last couple of weeks. But when you have India and so many countries that could easily, right, fall underneath the U.S. and Western neoliberal imperialist camp, moving toward China and Russia and saying there is no other option, very publicly, oftentimes. Even Saudi Arabia, I mean, I know you covered this on your channel, we covered it here. Even Saudi Arabia saying, absolutely not, we are not going to cut relations with China, because China, guess what? They built all of our 4G and they're building our 5G base stations. They're building everything for us. Why would we do that, right? Why would we that would put our political capital at risk. It's not as if the Saudi regime needs any more reasons to be illegitimate. So that's often also not talked about. The U.S. in its leading this neoliberal order is having trouble holding on. It is having trouble holding on because there are now options. It's not post-Soviet Union world order anymore. There isn't. China is not weak anymore. Russia is no longer dismembered and completely plundered. And also, these smaller countries now have good friends. Now they have reliable partners, and they can also brave storms with much more effectiveness than they would be able to before. Despite, I know you're in Nicaragua, I know you've been to Venezuela, there's immense suffering from sanctions, but still able to make progress, in part both because they have trustworthy friends now, and also in part because of their own, as you said, on their own volition and their own abilities and their own capacity to keep their movements, their sovereignty protected.
No, I couldn't agree more, Danny. And that's why I think it's so important to talk about all of this, and especially with a socialist perspective, right? Because it is true, I've acknowledged this, that there are some people talking about multipolarity who are more right-wing and conservative. Their vision of the world is very different. But the point is that multipolarity offers space for countries, especially in the global south, to have independent alternative paths of economic development. And that includes socialism. So obviously our goal is building towards socialism. And the reality is that under a unipolar system in which the US empire and US corporations and Wall Street and the IMF and the World Bank impose neoliberal structural adjustment policies on any country that wants to try to develop its economy, you can't develop socialism in those circumstances. There are a few honorable exceptions that we should acknowledge. Cuba survived that unipolar moment, but in the 1990s, the situation in Cuba was very difficult in the so-called special period, when its largest trading partner, the Soviet Union, was overthrown. Also, the DPRK went through a very difficult period around the same time. So there were countries that survived. The point, though, is not just to survive. The point is to thrive and develop the productive forces and raise the living standards of working people. And we now see that in Cuba, in Venezuela, in Nicaragua, in Bolivia, in Latin America. They're engaging on those processes of developing their economies with the help of China, of Russia, of Vietnam, of Iran. Iran plays an important role in this as well. We didn't talk about Iran. I mean, obviously, the Iranian government has a different model. And, it's not a model that I would personally, prefer, but I'm not Iranian. It's up for the Iranian people to choose their own political model, right? And the reality is that the Iranian economic model, which is almost never discussed, we constantly hear about the religious elements of the Iranian political model, but the economic model is also another model with significant state control of the economy. The oil is owned and exported by the state, right? People talk about the famous 1953 CIA-backed coup against Mohammad Mossadegh for nationalizing Iran's oil. Well, what they often forget is that today Iran's oil is still nationalized. It's still owned by the state, right? And large parts of the Iranian economy are still run by the state in this same way, right? A kind of economic nationalist model. It's not a socialist model, but it is an economic nationalist model in which significant resources and parts of the economy are owned and run by the state on behalf of the population to maintain economic stability and also to prevent the country from being colonized. Because if a country's resources are controlled by foreign corporations and those resources are used to fund, revenue for the state, then that country is partially colonized. You can't say that country is economically or even politically sovereign. And this is why the famous Ghanaian leader and socialist Nkrumah talked about neocolonialism, because many countries in the global south are still trapped under neocolonialism. They got formal independence on paper, at least political independence from colonialism, but their economies are largely controlled by Western capital. And what we're seeing, this process of multipolarity, is also just simply a process of some countries in the global south freeing themselves from neocolonialism.